screen. Welcome everybody. In case you're just joining us, you might notice in the chat we've been talking about our first jobs. So you're welcome to continue sharing that. And I'm Angela Unk. I'd like to welcome you to the 17th episode of the Clements Bookworm. So thank you so much for being here today. Just a reminder that we'll be recording today's session. Later today, you'll receive an email with a copy of the recording and links to any of the resources that we shared during today's broadcast. People are starting to find the chat function and share in there, and we love that. So please select all panelists and attendees so that we can all participate in the conversation. But you'll also notice that the conversation goes by really quickly. So if you have a question about today's presentation, please put that in the Q&A section. There you can ask questions. You can also give it a little thumbs up if you see somebody else's question that you would like to know the answer to, and that will help move it to the top of the queue. You can also type in an additional part to that question, or maybe even an answer to that question if you'd like to. So that's a good spot for the questions so that we can continue to see them. My colleague Ann Bennington-Helber, who you often see on this program in the chat, is on vacation today. So Tracy will be pasting in all those links and keeping an eye on the chat and answering any questions that we might miss in there. So thanks to Tracy for doing that today. In addition, I know not everyone is as familiar with Zoom, so I can only control how your screen is laid out to some degree, but you should have some ability to choose side-by-side mode if you would like, and change the amount that you see the slides versus the people. When people are talking, you can also switch between gallery view and speaker view. So feel free to play around with those settings since they're individualized to your experience. Okay, hopefully that helps everybody get settled. This Bookworm program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library is a repository of wonderful primary sources dating back to the 15th century and up through the beginning of the 20th century, helping us to study American history, and we really appreciate you being here today. Today's episode is generously sponsored by a Clements Bookworm appreciator who wanted to remain anonymous, but let you all know that that person's supporting the Bookworm, and we really appreciate people sponsoring these Bookworm episodes and sharing your love for these programs. So thank you so much. Today, we're in conversation with author Brian Luskey about his book, Minnie's Cheap, and I am pleased to introduce our other two panelists today. We have with us Dyke Benjamin, who is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Business School, and has been a student and collector of John Ruskin's works for 50 years. He served as director of Lazard Asset Management and is now managing director of Axiom Capital Management. Dyke was named a companion in Ruskin's Guild of St. George and elected an honorary member of the Bibliographical Society of America. He is the current president of the American Trust for the British Library. Dyke, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Pleasure, thank you.
I am also pleased to welcome Paul Erickson. In January, Paul became the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library. Before joining the Clements, he was Program Director for Humanities, Arts and Culture and American Institutions, Society, and the Public Good at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Paul, I understand that you have known Brian for a long time, and I'd love for you to introduce him.
I have. Thank you, Angela. One of the wonderful things about the Bookworm is that I have a lot of smart friends who write really good books, people that I've known in academic life for a long time. And so the Bookworm gives me a great excuse to read their book and talk to them. So we are delighted to be talking today with an old friend of mine, Brian Luskey, who is Associate Professor of History at West Virginia University. Brian received his PhD from Emory University and has held a number of prestigious research fellowships at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Virginia Historical Society, and the American Antiquarian Society, among others. He is the author or editor of 3 books. His first book, On the Make, Clerks and the Quest for Capital in 19th Century America, came out in 2010. He is co-editor, along with our mutual friend Wendy Wollaston, of the essay collection Capitalism by Gaslight, Illuminating the Economy of 19th Century America, which came out in 2015. And today, delighted to be talking about his new book, Men is Cheap, Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America, which you saw a picture of it before, but, well, you can't really see it there. We have a link to the book in the chat, and as well as a discount code, so you can buy it from UNC Press for 40% off. So buy some books. Thanks for being here, Brian. Great to see you.
It's great to be here, Paul. I really liked how my book just evaporated into your backdrop. That was wonderful magic.
It's kind of the same color as that picture, which is, I realize, is the problem. So one thing that we always like to ask authors when they're on the Bookworm is, you know, since the Clements is a library, we love hearing stories about discoveries in libraries. So how did you come to this project? Was there a moment in a library or an archive somewhere where you came across some sources that led you into this book?
There was. I think I've got to hop back into the past a little bit to explain that I thought I was researching a couple different book projects. One on a 19th century institution called the Intelligence Office, which was a labor agency, an employment bureau, where employers and employees met, negotiated bargains through the auspices of a middleman who collected a fee from both sides, typically in cities, typically for domestic workers in urban homes. But I also had an interest in soldiers' economies during the Civil War. How did soldiers think of the war as an event to realize their ambitions for success, and also to try to survive the fractured economy during the war, especially in terms of protecting their household economies. So I read a lot of correspondence between soldiers and their families back home. But it didn't really dawn on me that I could do both things in one book until I took a sabbatical year. I had very generous funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the program in Early American Economy and Society at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And I was in Philadelphia, and the fine folks at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania keyed me into 2 collections that I really drew on in this book, and they were the records of an organization called the Union Volunteer Refreshment Saloon, which was an organization designed to provide food and shelter for Northern soldiers passing through the city on their way to Washington and the South, to battlefields in the South. They included records of an effort by that same organization to place Confederate deserters in Northern homes. These men, particularly during the siege of Petersburg, would surrender themselves to Union forces and not be able to go home because they had deserted from Confederate forces, and they would be taken north to cities like Philadelphia, where they could seek employment through this office. And so you have a lot of correspondence from eager northern employers looking for workers. That was one set of records. And then the Pennsylvania Abolition Society also kept an intelligence office in which they placed recently emancipated slaves, typically women and children, who were moved by the Army and by other sectors of the government, of the state, to northern cities to also be placed in northern homes. So it was at that point where I understood that, and we can elaborate on this, how soldiers and their families back home understood the intelligence office as an institution that inspired great animosity among them, but it was also one they deeply needed to accomplish success through the employment of workers who would give their households a sense of respectability and refinement.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, so both people who were looking for jobs and people who were looking to hire people had to pay the intelligence office?
Yes, that's the way it worked in cities. Although with these Civil War offices, the people paying the fees were the employers and not the workers. And the one thing that the Civil War did was to provide more options for northern employers to find different groups of workers. So the people I mentioned here are not usually going, before the war, going to be the people who you could choose from as a northern employer. And that is being made possible because the federal government, the US government, is paying for those people's transportation to the north. And they do that in part because the Army decides, particularly with freed people, that the costs of providing them with food and shelter becomes too high in occupied areas of the South. And so they send them north to help them find work.
So Dyke, you're with us today because you lead a seminar out of Axiom Capital Management that meets weekly and discusses various books. And earlier this summer, Brian's book was one of the subjects of your group's discussion. So could you talk a bit about the seminar that you lead and why you chose to read Brian's book?
Absolutely. I manage a seminar which originally was entitled Business for Good. And now we have a different title, The Reformation of Capitalism, while generating a fair New England return. In other words, but we focus on business ethics, and we read all sorts of books that are more or less by authors that have an ethical point of view, whether it's positive or negative. And in addition to Brian's book, which we thoroughly enjoyed, we've read books by Ray Dalio, Stephen Schwartzman, Jim Simons, and many, many others in terms of their view on employees, how to treat them, the sustainability of profits, quality of their product, and so on, because it's our belief that business can be a very positive factor in an economy, and that a properly run business that cares about the environment, the employees, product quality, the profitability, and so on, can be a big hope for America, we think, as we go forward into the new economy. So, Brian, your book was great from the point of view of talking about business practices during the Civil War, and maybe what my first question to you is, because we want to bring business into a brighter light than fraud and speculation, and put a luster on it too. Not that we still don't have a lot of fraud and speculation in this country, but um, have you seen in your work businesses that were at least tried hard to have a ethical component, even if they didn't quite succeed? And then a light thought is, and to what extent were ethics used by these entrepreneurs to cover up some of their not so ethical practices?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Dyke. So indeed, 19th century businessmen certainly wanted to cast what they did in the market in an ethical light, and certainly felt that they were doing so. And so I guess the first thing would be to say is that free labor ideology, the ideology that valorized wage labor in comparison with slavery in the 19th century, was certainly by its proponents understood as an ethical system whereby workers, by virtue of them being able to earn wages, could save them and become independent. And even after that independence, could hire workers of their choice. And those capabilities, the possibilities of wage labor were thought to be part of a system where workers could rise in the world. And certainly kind of an example of that, both in his personal life and as a proponent in political circles, is Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s and 60s. So that ethical system was broadly shared among white Northerners. And so the intelligence office, because as an institution in an anonymous labor market, it was absolutely necessary, but because people look to these offices, and you see an image of one there in an 1849 painting, where young women who come to the office by virtue of hearing about it through newspaper advertisements, like you see crumpled up on the floor there. They're seeking employment in a household, and you see a woman who is there seated in the chair who would potentially hire one of these young women. That man who's standing up there is the intelligence office keeper. That notice on the wall says that his deals are warranted to be honest. And viewers of this painting would know that that assertion in and of itself was highly suspect. Intelligence office keepers had to get a license from the mayor to operate, but many evaded regulation through basement offices, and they'd change locations, and they would very often take fees from workers and then not find them jobs. Workers would be deeply, deeply upset and frustrated with them about that. And employers would also complain about intelligence office keepers for taking fees and giving them workers who didn't stay the course, who left the job too early, who weren't obedient enough, who weren't hardworking enough. And so this man was absolutely vital and necessary to the functioning of a labor market in the city, but he was also deeply hated, in part because of the ethics of the time, the ethics of how people thought business should be done, that people's word was their bond. And of course, the intelligence office keeper could say, look, I'm sorry, the labor market just means right now that the state of it means that I can't find you a job, or these were the workers available. But nevertheless, he took on a lot of criticism, in part because there was a discourse of ethics. Whether it was followed by everyone that's obviously not the case. And so what a lot of commentators said about these offices was, this is fraud being committed. And I in the book, I talk about this office because what is somewhat paradoxical is despite their hatred of these intelligence office keepers, they turn to intelligence offices time and time again to get workers. They need these people, even though they distrust them. And then I think that kind of illuminates the contradiction at the heart of free labor ideology. The supposed promise for workers to rise often is in direct opposition to that same ideology's declaration that employers have the right to find a wider variety of workers of their choice. And it's the Civil War that provides them more opportunities in finding those workers.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So, Brian, when thinking about free labor ideology, to what extent did people in the 19th century value the free part in terms of workers were able to take whatever job they wanted versus workers were free to leave a job? Because that seems to be sort of the big difference between previous models, obviously slavery, but also indentured servitude or apprenticeship, where you couldn't leave a job that you didn't like.
Sure, that's a great question, Paul. I should say that many waged workers experienced the transformations caused by industrialization in the early 19th century. They described them as wage slavery. And so by the 1850s, this free labor ideology was an effort to rehabilitate wage labor in opposition to slavery, in part because slaveholding politicians like James Henry Hammond of South Carolina were saying, look, Northerners, you have a class of people who are virtually enslaved anyway. They are the mudsill class of your society, the working people who actually can't rise. And it's that mudsill theory that Lincoln himself responds to and says, no, you don't understand. Workers here can become independent. I should say that there's a doctrine in the law that was just starting to be phased out in the 1840s and 50s, called the doctrine of entirety, which stated that employers did not owe workers back wages if they left the job before the contracted period. So that's just a doctrine that workers in the North are starting to see overturned in court cases in the late antebellum period. So the freedoms of that free labor ideology talks about for waged workers were just starting to become clearer, that they could choose jobs and then leave them whenever they wanted to. And I think that doctrine of entirety is important in my work because I study, in part, soldiers who themselves are to be paid wages every other month, but very often go 4 or 6 months without getting paid. And so I see that doctrine kind of creeping into the Civil War era and forcing Northern soldiers who believe strongly in free labor ideology, and they're really looking to become free and independent as they see it by employing other people, particularly fugitive slaves who come into their camp. They see that group of workers as being key to underscoring, especially if they're junior officers. They can hire these newly freed people as camp servants for them and underscore their own independence. But I see that uncertainty of wages in the Army as being something akin to those limits in the doctrine of entirety.
So Dyke, in your seminars, conversations about ethics in business, how prominent a role does employers' relationship to labor play in those ethical conversations?
Very important. We believe that labor is certainly the key to most corporations' success and how it's handled. And while one doesn't always think maybe of Ray Dalio and Stephen Schwartzman as being touchy-feely, At the same time, both of these very successful entrepreneurs care a lot about their employees. And not only their senior employees, but going down the experience chain to those that are bright that haven't had the opportunity to show their talents. They bring the young people into the conference room also and give them a lot of time to talk and monitor them. And also in this more and more emphasis on inclusion and diversity. This has been a statement by both of these gentlemen. So that's very important as we analyze these companies. And our thought with these ethical businesses is not only is it the right thing to do for the communities and for the businesses and for the product, but also these companies are making more money, some of them this way, and more sustainable. So it's not, let's allocate X dollars to being good. It's, let's make it part of our fabric. And this will pay off for the investor, for the employees, for the community, for the product quality. I think of a case when I was an analyst at Lazard Asset Management, and I went out to Crawford Fitting in Ohio, and there, the chairman of Crawford Fitting, Fred Lennon, took great pride not only in the employees, but their machines. And I think that the employees themselves took great pride in their machines, and they would show us how well buffed they were and so on. And they lived far beyond their depreciable life, the machines that they used to stamp out these fittings. My question to Brian is, was Abraham Lincoln a bit idealistic in the sense that Abe was the great example, great case study of a rail splitter, hiring an assistant, building capital, and lo and behold, becoming president of the United States in a very difficult time. Did he impute this work ethic to others, perhaps a bit naively? That's an odd thing to say about one of our greatest presidents, but did he hope that his work ethic was more universal, and was that part of the problem?
That's a good question. I don't think Abraham Lincoln was naive. I think he certainly believed in the kind of the three-step process where a worker could become independent and then hire workers of his own. And certainly his life exemplified that narrative of the self-made man that has been very powerful in American history. I think he probably undercounts the number of seasonal agricultural laborers in many parts of the northern countryside who did manual labor seasonally as a way to get by. Independence was tenuous, and I think he kind of tries to say in some of his late speeches in the late 50s and in the period right before he is elected president, that middle stage is a place where families could be more or less self-sufficient, kind of independent of other people's labor and other people's capital. And I don't believe that that was the case. But I certainly do think he believed in what he called leveling a playing field for the race of life, that wage labor allowed for opportunity for workers. He believed in that. I don't think that's necessarily naive. I also don't believe necessarily that he was a schemer, but the kind of the logic of the argument certainly supported his efforts to recruit and enlist men into the armed forces, first white soldiers and then African-American soldiers after 1863, such that he talked to some of his supporters later on in the war that the focus on manpower was always kind of front and center for him. So he allowed recruiters who were up to no good to do their work, even in fraudulent and nefarious ways, because doing so helped save the Union.
And this was his, the reason for handling John Nelson the way he did. In your book, you talk
Sure.
about
and so
a soldier that...
yeah. I can talk about John Nelson as a example of this sort of recruiter. In this book, I focus in on a handful of characters who come in each chapter, and kind of regularly occurring characters. And John Nelson is one of them. He was an Irish immigrant who settled in Hartford, Connecticut. He ran a sparring school and was also a machinist. He did a number of different things occupationally, but he recruited a company in Connecticut for one of the 90 days regiments at the beginning of the war. And then once that enlistment ran out, he joined another company as captain of the 9th Connecticut, an all-Irish regiment, who became part of a division of soldiers that was being recruited in New England by former Democratic politician Benjamin Butler. Butler came into conflict himself in recruiting against the Republican governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, and I talk about this dispute in the book. But Nelson ends up recruiting Massachusetts men to fill up his Connecticut regiment's company, which leads to all sorts of trouble for these men in terms of collecting payments that each one of these states had promised to soldiers' families. And it also makes things complicated for Nelson because he loses his commission in the process of being transferred to Butler's command. Butler, once he starts to recruit African-American men in the Gulf, in and around New Orleans, he has use for Nelson again. And Nelson, as a colonel of one of these USCT or U.S. Colored Troops regiments, leads African-American soldiers to great acclaim during the siege of Port Hudson. And this is one of the first instances in the war in which African-Americans fought in battle and proved their bravery to a lot of skeptical white Northerners. At the same time, Nelson dabbles in cotton speculation and other sort of fraudulent activities, things he shouldn't be doing. And when Butler is replaced by another general, Nathaniel Banks, Banks presents to Nelson a choice whether to be court-martialed for this illicit activity or to have an honorable discharge. And he takes the latter, but then winds up back in Washington. And he goes right to the White House and tells the president that he was the most important actor in recruiting African-American soldiers in the Gulf, and that Lincoln should put him to that job elsewhere. And Lincoln does, in part because by late 1863, he needs men like Nelson to do that kind of work at a time in which a lot of white Northerners are coming to support the part of the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln wrote that offered African-American men the opportunity to serve in the military. A lot of white Northerners are coming to support that by understanding that Black men could serve in white men's places. And so Nelson sets up in Tidewater, Virginia, recruiting African-American men at the same time that Butler is placed in command of that department. Now, Butler sets up new rules for how wage labor would work in this district. And he does that by limiting the wage African-American men can make in that district. And not coincidentally, it's $10 a month, which at that time was the going rate for African-American soldiers. And so what he's doing is he's funneling African-American men in this area into the military. Now, his subordinate Nelson does so in a different way. He does so by sending out a press gang and coercing men at bayonet point into serving in his regiment. That's something that Nelson is court-martialed for, but it's obviously it's at this point where, you know, the question of ethics becomes vital again, I think, because Butler says impressment is wrong, even at the same time that he's limiting the wages that African-American men can make in his department. So wage labor, it's fair to say, includes a fair number of coercions, at the same time that free labor's proponents are saying that efforts like impressment are bad and what we're doing is good.
It's so interesting, and the whole issue of coercion and freedom, and is in fact slavery being exported to the North in some cases where the coercion is
Yeah, I guess
part of the equation.
Yeah,
It's all concerned.
just to interject about that, it's fair to say that what I'm talking about in my book is wage labor. It's not slavery. And yet it's slavery's existence is kind of a foil for white Northern employers to say that what we're doing is not slavery. But and I guess I would say that even the men who are being impressed into Nelson's regiment during testimony in the court-martial speak to their own desire to give their consent. They understand that as an aspect of citizenship, that they have obligations to the nation that is fighting against slavery, but they want to enlist on their own time, by their own decision. They want that autonomy. And in fact, the press gang is making their autonomous, independent efforts to prosper economically through agriculture and other jobs very difficult. So it's certainly at that moment they're forced to negotiate the contradictions of free labor ideology, which in some ways encompasses both choice and consent on the one hand and coercion on the other.
One of the really striking things that comes out in this in your book, Brian, aside from the fact that John Nelson did an extraordinary amount of living in what was a relatively short life, at the end of the book, I don't want to give away too many surprises, but when he passes away, you say he's only 45 years old, and I think, oh my God, he did an awful lot in 45 years. But one thing that's really striking is the extent to which free labor ideology was so deeply woven up with how men made their decisions to serve in the Army. So people would wait to sign up until the bonuses were larger. They would sort of venue shop. Oh, I'm going to sign up with this regiment because they'll pay better, even though I'm not from Massachusetts. Could you talk a little bit about, like, was that new? Was that a new way of thinking about military service in the United States, or sort of how did that come into being?
That's a good question, and maybe looking at the posters would be a good idea. Yeah. If you could cue those up. Certainly, bounties were not new. They had been offered in previous conflicts as well. But I do argue in the book that the process of enlistment, of choosing which regiment in which to serve, and the efforts by company commanders who are trying to recruit their companies, that's all of that process is shaped by an antebellum culture of ambition, of speculation, and it's reflected in some of these posters. And I should say, first of all, that our mutual friend Joanna Cohen has done great work to explain how the poster on the left reflects business owners' attempts to connect consumer purchases with citizenship. If you buy here, you're patriotic. This store owner, I think in Western Pennsylvania, bought an advertisement from a Philadelphia firm and used these images right at the beginning of the war to try to get volunteers to buy in their store and promote misguided or spread misguided news about Fort Sumter being retaken. But you're going to get war prices, it says. Buying now will get you a better deal, as business owners here in the North are dealing with an economic downturn caused by secession and their inability to collect Southerners' debts. But those same images are used by this same Philadelphia printing firm for recruitment posters. And these are fairly large posters. These ones I think might be like a foot by a foot and a half in size. They're meant to be plastered on the side of buildings to get people's attention. Right. And as I say in the book, the messages here are: this is how much you'll collect on signing with this company, how much you'll collect at the end of the war. And there were bounties instituted, federal bounties of $100 instituted in May of 1861. So I certainly don't want to suggest that soldiers did not enlist for ideological reasons, for cause and comrades, as James McPherson said. That's true. But certainly at the same time, they were also concerned about economic issues. How am I going to survive economically, and how is my family going to survive economically? There are a lot of men signing up who are going to take a pay cut for doing so. There's a soldier whose correspondence I don't cite in the book mentions to his wife that a clerk he's become friendly with in the ranks is there with him at Fort Hamilton in New York City before they go to the front, and he keeps telling his wife, "I don't know why he's here. He was making $600 a year." So there are lots of different sort of I guess factors that these men are weighing, and they're all doing so within kind of intersecting cultures of patriotism, of free labor ideology, and of this culture of speculation where you're trying to get the best deal for yourself and your family.
Right. We're getting close to time when we want to open it up to questions, but I do want to ask one last question. So books are always, there's always more research done than you can fit in the book. So is there a particular story or character that you had really hoped to get into the book that that just didn't make it in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I probably did enough research for several books, and there's certainly a lot of I think the thing that I lament in as I said, bringing these two projects together as one, I had to excise a lot of stuff about this culture of speculation and commerce that existed during the war. And so I certainly would like to tell people about a source in the Clements library, which is a journal by a guy named Samuel Taylor. It's a journal. It's very interesting. It evidently was recopied from the wartime in something like 1890. And he was a clerk for a Philadelphia clothing firm, Charles Stokes and Company, which is a firm that I saw a lot of advertisements for when I did research in Philadelphia. But Taylor was sent to occupied Memphis in 1862 and 1863 to try to offload kind of unfashionable clothing to anybody who would buy it, but probably soldiers who were living in Memphis, or Southerners who were unable to find other options. Unfortunately for him, when he gets there are so many rules and regulations, and he's been beaten to the punch by so many other commercial actors in that market that he's unable to sell the goods. But in the meantime, he talks about a lot of fraud, a lot of speculation, and tries to make sort of invidious comparisons that other people are, doing wrong, while he is an ethical businessman. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of other, there'd be a great book that I'm probably not going to write that would just focus in on soldiers' economies and how they acted in economic ways in camp and connecting to their households back home.
Great. Dyke, did you have any last question that you wanted to ask before we open it up?
One lots of burning questions, but one that I'd like to put out there. Andrew Johnson kind of aborted the idea that the freed slaves should have their own plot of land. And also there were attempts made at educating the freed slaves that were unsuccessful, that you talk about in your book. I would really like one of your next books to deal with educating these unfortunate people to the point where they may get a better education and become more proficient wage earners. Our seminar is close to the Ron Brown Scholar System, which takes talented African Americans and through a rigorous selection process puts them into good colleges. And we have one that we had on our seminar yesterday that went back to Mississippi after his term at Harvard and is really trying to build what he described as once one of the wealthiest, the Mississippi area is one of the wealthiest areas in America, and now the poorest, through education and through land holdings and benefits and so on. So the education part of the equation is very important to, I think, bring this labor force into a productive wage category.
Right. So, Angela, I don't know if we want to go through a couple of the slides and give Brian a chance to talk about some of the images before we open it up to questions, or what would you like to do? I actually can't see you.
Sorry, I had myself on mute and I started talking anyway. So I know you hit upon some of these concepts that are in these images, answering some of the questions, but they are such interesting images. I thought before I wrap up, maybe you'd like to talk about them for a moment.
Sure, I'd be happy to. These images are all drawn by a Philadelphian who was the artistic director of a New York comic publication called Vanity Fair. His name was Henry Louis Stevens. The first image shows a Union soldier, and the caption reads 6 months in arrears. And I seem to remember that the lowercase caption, I can't read it from here, says something to the effect of, what about the children at home?
God help the little ones at home.
Yeah, the sacrifice by soldiers, and it turns on the fact that they're not being paid regularly. Stevens was had occupied a very I think interesting sort of subset of supporters of the Lincoln administration and of emancipation, but who were the editorial board of Vanity Fair, but who were also deeply racist, and were concerned about the competition between African American workers and white Northern workers if they were put in competition with each other in the North. I have to say, though, that these editors also speak for an employing class for whom that competition is exciting because that can give them a chance to get the vulnerable worker of their choice. But Stevens also read the market, and so he produced a set of images about the transition from slavery to freedom that is represented by the middle image. These were small trade cards that consumers could buy as a set. So he's thinking about a market for these images, and he depicts an African-American soldier at the point he labels victory, dying as a worker, as I say in the book, a wage worker, falling for the cause of free labor ideology. But Stevens never really lost his sort of concern about what the Lincoln administration, what the war was doing to white Northern workers. And so that last image is from the election cycle of 1864. It's titled "The Idol of Abolitionism," and the caption reads, "I want 500,000 more." And he's this awful sort of monster Lincoln is eating a soldier. And I guess I've got to say too that one way in which Lincoln understands the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, he tells a supporter this leading up to the presidential campaign of 1864. This supporter is saying, you should revoke the Emancipation Proclamation and therefore get more support from white Northerners who opposed it. And he said, I can't do that. It certainly wouldn't be fair to people who had put their lives in the line for the Union, and we would lose their manpower, which we should measure just as we do steam power and horsepower. So there's something that is reflected in that cartoon that Lincoln himself believed. And to respond to Dyke's point at the end, I think we have to realize that institutions that were created for the quote unquote uplift of freed people, like the Freedmen's Bureau, included an effort to open schools, included efforts to negotiate wage labor contracts, often with former masters, but also the Freedmen's Bureau opened an intelligence office of its own and took formerly enslaved people from Washington and the surrounding area in Maryland and Virginia and sent them north. It's important, I think, to understand that a lot of those workers left those jobs very early on, to the dismay of Northern employers who thought they were doing a very nice thing by employing and quote unquote educating them in the precepts and habits of free labor ideology, but that a lot of these workers resisted efforts to control their movement and left anyway. And so I think that's an important sort of tension that maybe we could end with.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Thank you. This is great, Brian, and thanks so much to Dyke and Paul for participating in the conversation. I am just going to do a couple of housekeeping things, and then we'll get to questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll start looking through those in a couple of moments. I hope that you'll all join us for next week's episode. We have a reader panel talking about literature and public life in the 19th century with some wonderful panelists discussing both their work and books available. So please join us next week. Now that you've signed up for the Bookworm, if you're new to our program, you do not have to sign up again. You'll receive a reminder for subsequent episodes, and you can choose to watch live, or as today, you'll receive an email later with the recording and the resources available. So we hope that we'll see you again. I also want to mention that we would love to have supporters to sponsor upcoming episodes, so you're welcome to write to me about that. And also, of course, if you feel inclined to support the Clements Library, I know many of you already do, and we thank you so much. But as you can imagine at this time, there's a great need for digitization and for us to sort of pivot our work during this pandemic crisis. So without further ado, let's look at the Q&A, shall we?
Sure. And just before you continue, Angela, Brian, I put in the chat, I'm glad you talked about Henry Stevens, because he produced one of my favorite really weird 19th century books, The Comic Natural History of the Human Race.
Yeah,
Which
brilliant.
is, for people who haven't seen it, it's this amazing collection of lithographs of mostly Philadelphia local celebrities with their heads superimposed on the bodies of insects or animals. And they're in full color, and it's just absolutely a wonderful thing. So next time people come into the Clements Library, you should ask to see it, because it's
Thank
crazy.
you.
Sorry, Angela.
No, I love those kinds of serendipitous asides. All right, so let's see. Amelia is asking, did the free labor ideology have implications for popular views of domestic labor, waged or unwaged?
Indeed. The way that unfolds in my book, I guess is, one way to tackle that very good question is to say that the figure of the Irish immigrant domestic servant before the war, very often this figure would be called the biddy, B-I-D-D-Y, as kind of a label for this group, would be understood to be disobedient, looking for a better job, and in very strange ways, employers would say, well, these are bad things because they make us have to do work in our own house if a domestic worker didn't do it, or find another worker. They prove to be a troublesome figure. And I would say that most Irish immigrant domestic workers were impoverished. But the work of historians like Tyler Anbinder and others show that some of these Irish women were able to save a lot of their wages in institutions like the Emigrant Savings Bank in New York. And so they were doing precisely what wage workers ought to do, according to free labor ideology. And it's part of my argument that I think this shows pretty clearly that even when workers do what is expected of them in ideological ways, that employers aren't too impressed. Their desire for workers of their choice loom much larger, are more important to them than the ability of workers to rise. And so that's one way of answering that question. I will say that another way would be to look at soldiers and their families, and to look at the work that wives did on the home front to negotiate loans, to bring in crops, to serve as the household's sort of head in many ways in economic terms during the war, while their husbands were hundreds of miles away. So their work, not only in the home, but being the economic face of their families, was crucial to the survival of those families.
Thank you. Speaking of women, Anne is asking, how do women fit into the free labor model?
That's a great question too, and something I talk about in the book is that the way in which Lincoln describes the transition from wage worker to independent man of capital is, of course, in a gendered way as a man. It's striking to me that one of the places he gives speeches about this transition is New England, places like New Haven, Connecticut, and he talks explicitly about a prominent shoemaker strike that is happening simultaneously in Lynn, the center for shoemaking in New England. And what he doesn't reckon with is that a lot of those workers are female. And so those women are having their own debates about whether they should be fighting for the breadwinner wage for husbands, a higher wage for husbands, or more wages for all shoe workers. And that debate certainly centers around whether the household economy of married women shoe workers should be more or less important than single women who are doing that same labor. And so that's certainly a debate that's happening at the time. And so I think when most proponents of free labor ideology talk about this right to rise, they're talking about men for sure. But women in this particular case are advocating for themselves, even though different groups of women have different interests to defend.
Interesting. Thank you. Let's see. Elizabeth asks, how were the Confederate deserters treated by the Northerners? Were they trusted or held in a position of suspicion?
Great question. And one that I guess I have to be honest and say I didn't answer to the extent that I wanted to. These men are supposed to take an oath of allegiance when they are taken into the processing area around Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters at City Point on their way north. It's clear from some correspondence that some do, and they say, you know, I'm very happy here. They write back to the labor agent at the Union Volunteer Refreshment Saloon. And so they do either formally or informally declare their allegiance. But I don't believe all of them did, not in a formal way. And I think a lot of them just kind of rolled with this, and this was an opportunity to get back on their feet until they could reunite with their families. And I do have evidence that I cite in the book of a few families. You have the soldier desert Lee's army and give word to his family that he's doing that, and they refugee out of the South at the same time and wind up in Philadelphia together. So it's a way of reuniting families. But I think it's also interesting to note that a lot of white Northern employers don't seem to care. They just want workers, and these are the available workers. And there's sort of the same sort of discourse of, you know, anybody that you might have in your office, whether a Confederate deserter or an African-American worker, I'll take anybody. Or I want a particular worker, and with a lot of very specific and racist sort of emphases on skin color. And so white Northern employers are very sort of particular in many cases too. I do know that a lot of Confederate deserters did go home eventually, but it's long after the war. But some resettle in the North, and they become members of these Northern communities. So I would say probably in the end, to answer the question, the answer is probably mixed in terms of respect and sort of community inclusion.
Thank you. Dyke, this next one from Elizabeth is for you. She's interested in hearing what other books Axiom Capital's seminar has read.
Yes. Well, we've read Ray Dalio's Principles, which is quite good. And there is a fellow that runs a Bridgewater hedge fund, one of the best records in the world. And he's very rigorous in terms of a manager, but he also cares for the employees. And we've also read a wonderful book by Stephen Schwartzman, and that's now on the bestseller list. And there again, he's very rigorous, but he does care for the employees. And actually, he spoke at the Harvard Club at the time we were reading the book. So I took my group over there, and one of my members who's about to go to law school, seminar members, stood in line to ask a question. Mr. Schwartzman, what do you do about the environment in your startups? And he said, oh, we always are. And he spent about 3 or 4 minutes with her in front of a whole big room, telling that the environment is very important to us. And subsequently, he has come out and underscored that, and also underscored how he wants to be inclusive in his hiring. As I say, these people are tough people, but they're very good. We've read a wonderful book by Joe Wilson on Xerox, the founder of Xerox, that I recommend. And if she would like, I'll email her a list with the publisher and the dates and so on, and be happy to add some others to it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay. We have a question from Damon. What was the role of abolitionists in regards to this free labor ideology?
Good question. So my point in the book is to include these labor agents and soldiers and families and down on their luck merchants who tried to prosper through the recruitment of labor during the Civil War. I think they're an important faction in the coalition of Northerners who engineered emancipation. And I should say that obviously the group who is most prominent in that coalition are enslaved people in the South themselves, acting as in refugeeing to Northern Army lines and making emancipation the most important issue of the war and leading to this transformation. Abolitionists are, I guess I would say, is there are certainly individuals and institutions who try to assist formerly enslaved people to get jobs in the North. So the individuals I mention in the book include Lewis Tappan in New York City, William Still, an important African-American abolitionist in Philadelphia, and I link his work with the Underground Railroad in the 1850s, with his service as the first intelligence office agent for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society when that gets started in 1862. Certainly, there's a bit of paternalism among white abolitionists who, as I said, some white members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society talk about teaching African Americans the habits and principles of free labor ideology, and so they understand this as an educational process akin to apprenticeship. But certainly there's a difference between that stance and African American abolitionists like William Still. He is constantly forced to negotiate or balance his own self-interest as a businessman selling a variety of groceries and coal and other things as a businessman, and his work as an abolitionist. And I think still among the other characters in my book emerges as a true hero. I mean, he really defines these quests for freedom in collective terms, that it's not just about self-interest. And I think that you can see that in his work, not only in that office, which he has to give up because it becomes too much of a burden on him. And then that's at that point in 1863-64, where white agents take control, and the kind of the cast of what the Pennsylvania Abolition Society is doing changes slightly, but still ends up being a sutler, a camp merchant at the main recruiting post, Camp William Penn in Philadelphia. And it's that experience. There's one moment where Still, with a white clerk that he employs, try to get on a streetcar right outside the camp to ride back into the city to their homes. And that white clerk is allowed into the streetcar, and Still has to nearly freeze himself standing on the outside of the car because of segregation in public accommodations. And it's that experience which returns Still to the major political questions of the Reconstruction period, about trying to desegregate public accommodations. But it's kind of all part of a broader process of emancipation. And I think, as many historians have said, emancipation, we shouldn't think of that as a synonym for freedom. This is a process whereby African Americans have to advocate politically for the rights of citizenship.
Thank you.
And if I can just jump in, Angela, I think it's also important to not think of abolitionist as being a synonym for anti-racist. I mean, there were plenty of abolitionists who, their whole goal was once African Americans were freed, we should send them someplace else, because they didn't want them to stay in the United States. So
certainly there were colonizationists who believed that, and they're kind of, I think, we can say on the conservative sort of part of this political coalition that could include Republicans. So people like Francis Blair, in conversations with Lewis Tappan, would say, Tappan said, well, can we take some of these former slaves from occupied Virginia and help you, Benjamin Butler, by taking them off your hands and placing them in northern homes? And Blair says, well, no, we should send them to Haiti, to basically to whiten U.S. society. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thanks. There's one question that's in the chat that I thought we might want to address. It's from Molly, and asking, did you come across any evidence of things like unionization or minimum wage in your research?
No, I don't think I did. I guess one way to answer that, though, is to say that there certainly was controversy about the wages offered to African American soldiers in comparison to white soldiers, which it's also important to realize that Black soldiers advocating on their behalf were able to strike down that inequality by 1864. And so by the end of the Civil War, white and Black soldiers were reimbursed at an equal level. There's certainly there are good books about unions during the Civil War, and there's a great book by Mark Lause, L-A-U-S-E, called Free Labor, and it does chart the efforts of unionized workers and the kind of the role unions had to play in the North, as certainly wage levels tended to go up during the war because there was less competition for jobs at home while soldiers fought, although inflation kind of cut into those those wage levels, those increased wages. And I should say that probably it's important to realize that even though racist white Northern workers thought that they were going to be disadvantaged by having to compete with African Americans who came north, that the group of people who were actually most affected by the arrival of freed people in northern cities were Black Northerners. And you can see in the records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, it's pretty clear to me that they're listing free Black Northerners alongside formerly enslaved Southerners in their efforts to place those folks out to jobs too. So free Black Northerners who came forced to come into competition for work with these former slaves sought out the intelligence office because that was in some ways the only game in town, the only way they could find work. And I think that's a kind of a sad sort of addendum to this story too.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks so much, all of you, for being here and for this conversation. And thank you to all of our attendees. We appreciate your good questions and your engagement. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
And we'd like to thank you very much. Nice working with you. And Paul.
Thank you, Angela.
A pleasure to meet you, Brian. And thank you again for the wonderful book.
Thanks, Angela. Thank you, Dyke, and thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Good to see you. Thanks, Dyke.
All right,
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.